Time for Reason About Radio. In this series on broadcasting, Lyman Bryson is discussing broadcasting as it affects you, the listener. He will give you facts on broadcasting and how it may affect our future. Now, Mr. Bryson will tell what listeners have been saying in letters to CBS. He speaks today from the studios of WBAB, Columbia's affiliate in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Mr. Bryson.
An indignant letter came in a few days ago telling me that I was not playing fair in asking for criticisms of broadcasting because when I got any letters that were interesting, I read them over the air and gave the names and addresses of the writers whether or not they wanted to be known. She was mistaken. No letter is read without the permission of the writer. But it does seem better to tell whose letters I am quoting. We do not make them up in the office. They are coming to us in stacks, and I wish more of them could be read. Not because they are complimentary, they are often severe, but they are real comments from thoughtful listeners, and we believe that comments of this kind should be heard and answered, and if we can remedy what they complain about, we will do it. Dr. C. L. Sherman of 3528 Quebec Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., understands something of what we are up against in an enterprise of this sort. Dr. Sherman writes, I'm quoting, I've just been listening to you on the radio, and I can easily see what a vast amount of varied criticism you must have to face, because the radio has become the companion of the lonely, solace of the ill and distraught. The radio aims to satisfy the desire of those who like music, stories for those who like to read, and I feel that radio is doing a fine job. There is plenty of room for criticism, and like everyone, I feel that many of the programs grate on my sensitive nervous system. For instance, the overzealous salesman who tells how much better his product is than any other. That's the end of the quotation. Dr. Sherman goes on to object to unreasonable claims in advertising, asks for more detective stories and fewer horror stories, doesn't like murder, and thinks we should have more good light music. As for the claims of the advertisers, I have already explained that we try, that is, the broadcasting systems try to keep them within bounds. We have found most of the advertisers willing to cooperate. When we get a complaint of this kind, we think it is only fair, however, to ask the listener to make sure that it was a CBS program that made the mistake, a Columbia Broadcasting System network program. But it is a problem that will always plague us and will have to be talked about again. Here is another complaint of a kind that seldom comes in. The letter is from Dan Mowry, 3116 Montana Street, El Paso, Texas. Mr. Mowry says in part, now I'm quoting, my one and only criticism of the Columbia programs is that they are not completely democratic, and I shall try to illustrate my claim. I am convinced that different types of Columbia programs tend to ignore certain sections of the United States, and that the eastern and midwestern sections dominate the programs as a whole. So Mr. Mowry writes, and then he makes his case. Audience participation shows, he says, and quiz programs, even information please, almost never include people from the South or the Southwest. Mr. Mowry says we do not even read testimonial letters from the South or the Southwest. California gets in, of course, but not Texas. To go on with his letter, he says, almost all the news comes from the East and the Midwest, whether important or trivial. I might point out that there was recently a train wreck in Connecticut or Massachusetts in which about 14 cars were derailed, but no one was injured. I'm positive that this wreck would never have been reported if it had happened in Alabama or New Mexico. Mr. Mowry, he says, we're biased even in sports. He writes, and I'm quoting, until Red Barber assumed the role of director of the sports department, the South and Southwest were almost completely ignored, in spite of the fact that some of the most powerful teams are always found in these sections. That's the end of the quotation. Then Mr. Mowry adds that we lay the plot of the typical crime story in an eastern city. He thinks we ought to lay a few crime plots down in the South or the Southwest. Evidently they have crime there, too. And above all, this is the worst of our sins. We play New York and Eastern dialects as if they were pure, beautiful English, and we always make fun of Southern speech. So he says. As far as I'm concerned, as just one responsible broadcaster, I think there is some sense in what Mr. Maury has to say. We are provincial in New York and in Washington, in Chicago and in Hollywood, where radio programs are generally produced, just as people are everywhere else. We're provincial and we show it. But we're not quite so provincial as Mr. Maury makes out. We do take quiz questions from the South. We do even sometimes lay the plot of a detective story in the South. No doubt we ought to think more often of that part of the country. This is a criticism for the record to be considered in the future. Now to turn to another point. We get a great number of letters from listeners who say that there are many good things on the air, but these good things are broadcast at inconvenient times. Here's an example. Herbert Bebb, 753 First National Bank Building of Chicago, writes as follows, and I'm quoting. I'm much interested in your radio discussions of radio, but I also like to listen to the University of Chicago Roundtable program, and the two come at the same time. This kind of jostling occurs often enough to convince me that it is deliberate. Be that as it may, can you claim that American radio is offering the continuous range of choice that it could? At times, the ether is monopolized by virtually duplicating soap operas, and at other times by baseball, dance bands, and giveaway programs, contrasting with the overdose of highbrow on Sunday. And admitting that all these types have their followings, and that a majority want baseball in season, it still should be possible to serve the minority who want something else. There are plenty of channels to go around. That's the end of the quotation from Mr. Bebb's letter. The question is far more complicated than it seems. It will have to be admitted in the beginning that no broadcaster, not even the most conscientious, thinks he can ever satisfy everybody with the arrangements of the schedules. It might be a good idea to begin by clearing up a few misconceptions. A writer on radio in a magazine not very long ago said with reckless generosity that a certain good debate program would have 100 times as many listeners if it could be put on at a good evening hour. Now, we can pass over the fact that the most popular program on the air does not have 100 times as many listeners as any other program. Radio audiences do not differ in size by that much. The lowest-ranking network program, lowest, I mean, in size of audience, will practically always have a rating of from 1 to 2 points. And the highest ratings seldom go above 30 points. This is quite a stretch, from 1 to 30, but it's not 100 times. It is, as a matter of fact, just about the same difference that you will find if you compare a weekly magazine that is given to serious discussion of current affairs and literature and ideas with one of the popular weeklies that is full of pictures and stories and articles of a less serious sort. It is the normal difference between anything that appeals to a few and what appeals to many. This is true only, of course, of the comparative sizes of these two groups, the magazine subscribers and the listeners to the radio. It goes without saying that the audiences for radio programs of all kinds are always much larger than the reader groups for magazines. A serious discussion program on the CBS network or any other network may have what is for radio a very modest following, say 500,000 to 1 million people every week. Most serious weeklies of comment and information consider themselves successful if 50,000 people, 1/10 of the small radio audience, will read each weekly issue. A radio news analyst who has a following far smaller than the following of a famous comedian may still have more listeners than there are subscribers or purchasers for any weekly magazines, even the great ones, any in the United States. Probably no magazine or publication of any kind reaches as many people each week as listen to the most popular radio programs. Broadcasting always deals in big numbers. This doesn't provide an answer, however, to those who say that the good things are never on the air when they want to listen. Everybody, they say, listens in the evening, and you put on a good many things that are intended for serious listeners in the daytime, especially on Saturday and Sunday. It's true that a good many of our serious programs, not all, but a good many, are broadcast by the network in the daytime. But before you come to any conclusions about what is useful about this business, what is really to be explained about it, look at the facts. Remember the time zones, for example. A program broadcast in New York at 6 o'clock in the afternoon will reach Chicago in the Middle West at 5, the Rocky Mountains at 4, the Pacific Coast at 3 in the afternoon. Local stations make all kinds of adjustments to this time difference. If a program which comes at an appropriate spot in the east, an appropriate time spot, reaches the West Coast at a bad time, it may be transcribed and rebroadcast later, or at an earlier hour on another day. But the amount of such readjustment that can be made is limited by the local interests of the broadcaster and the demands of his local audience. He cannot make everything come at 9 o'clock in the evening of the best day in the week. And it is a mistake also to think that no one listens to the radio except in the evening. When the People's Platform discussion goes on the air in New York at 1 o'clock each Sunday, something more than 20%, perhaps less than 25%, of all the radio receiving sets in the United States are tuned in to some one of the many programs on the air at that time. Their owners are listening to something on the air. That's the possible audience. From that time in the middle of the day on Sunday, the number of sets tuned in steadily increases until 9 o'clock Sunday evening, when it may go as high as 47%. But note that it practically never goes to 50%. Practically never, unless some very special event happens, are half of all the radios in the United States turned on at once. On weekdays, the variation is about the same. During the morning, about 15% of all the sets in the country will be tuned in. During the middle of the afternoon, it may go to 17%, less, you see, than on Sunday afternoon. But by 5 o'clock on an ordinary day, it will be up to 20%, and in the evening, it will reach its 9 o'clock peak somewhere above 40%. Saturday afternoon will be like any other weekday or better, especially when some big sports event is on the air. I know these figures are confusing, and I am offering them only to show that the serious programs do not get such bad treatment as is often complained of. They are not put on the air when nobody is listening. We're often criticized in letters and sometimes by newspaper critics for putting on a good serious program on our network when a popular entertainment show occurs at the same time spot on a competing network. This question offers a tough dilemma. The broadcaster is going to get into trouble with the admirers of serious music or drama or fine discussion, whatever he does. If he puts the program on in the afternoon, Sunday or Saturday, he will be criticized for offering it when nobody, or at least not the people interested, are likely to be listening. If he puts it on in the evening, it will have to compete with popular entertainment and will not have much chance to get a really large audience. So, caught between the horns of this dilemma, he tries it both ways. He puts some serious programs on in the daytime and some on in competition with popular entertainment on other networks. But he has to take either one handicap or the other. There's no good evening time when a large proportion of the radios are tuned in that is not filled with popular entertainment shows. That's when they come. There is no daytime spot when everybody can be enticed to listen to the radio. It isn't convenient. Now, I've tried both horns of this dilemma in my own broadcasting. I have gone on with serious political discussions in competition with one of the best of the great comedians. And I have done the same program at a number of different daytime hours when I was not competing with great entertainment. And I couldn't see that there was much choice. Size of audience remained about the same. If there was any difference, it was in favor of the afternoon time. That is, a time when there was not great entertainment competition. The afternoon spot seemed to get me a better audience than the first-rate commercial spot in the evening. Now, some of our critics have suggested that we should try in this country something like the new experiment launched by the British Broadcasting Corporation in the British Isles. They have over there a new series of programs running through several hours of evening time, containing nothing that is mere entertainment. They read novels, they perform whole plays, even if they run for several hours, and they do all the other things that require more sustained attention and more serious interest than most of broadcasting, either here in America or in Great Britain, usually does. It is still too early in the experiment to say whether or not a large number of British listeners are going to like it. Some Americans believe that we should have in this country more stations, perhaps even a whole network devoted to more serious broadcasting. But this is the kind of question that the public has not only the right, but the responsibility to decide. Obviously, it is a question that requires much more discussion than I can give it now. I hope to take it up at another time.
You have just heard a talk on broadcasting by Lyman Bryson in his series Time for Reason about radio. He spoke today from the studios of WBAB, Columbia's affiliate, in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Mr. Bryson will continue his series about broadcasting next week at this same time. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.